After my hip surgery, I came home on crutches and found my suitcase on the porch with a note from my DIL. "I'm not cleaning up after you anymore." The next day, I bought the building and tripled her rent. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Glenda, and at 68 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of cruelty life could offer. I was wrong. The taxi pulled up to the apartment building where I'd lived for the past 15 years, the same building where my son Daniel and his wife Romy had their unit just 2 floors above mine. My hip surgery had gone well, the doctor said, but I'd need these damn crutches for at least 6 weeks. Every step sent a shooting pain up my side, but nothing compared to what I was about to discover. There, sitting on the concrete landing outside my apartment door, was my old leather suitcase, the one I'd packed 3 weeks ago when I went to stay with my sister Margaret before the surgery. But why was it here, outside, instead of safely inside my apartment where Romy had promised to keep it? My hands trembled as I fumbled with the crutches, trying to get closer. That's when I saw it, a piece of white paper tucked under the suitcase handle, fluttering slightly in the autumn breeze. The taxi driver, a kind Middle Eastern man who'd helped me from the hospital, noticed my confusion. "You okay, lady? You need help with the bag?" I think there's been a mistake," I said, though deep down I knew there hadn't been. I bent down as much as my healing hip would allow and pulled the note free. The handwriting was Romy's, that perfect, controlled script she was so proud of. But the words felt like ice water flowing through my veins. "I am not your maid anymore. I'm done cleaning up after you and taking care of your mess. Find somewhere else to recover. Don't bother calling Daniel, he agrees with me. Romy." I read it twice, then 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. The taxi driver was watching me now, concern creasing his weathered face. "Everything all right?" I couldn't speak. I just stood there, leaning heavily on my crutches, staring at this piece of paper that had just shattered what was left of my family. Romy had promised to help me during my recovery. She'd insisted on it, actually, when Daniel suggested hiring a nurse. "Don't be silly," she'd said with that bright smile she wore like a mask. "I'll take care of Glenda. She's family." Family. The word tasted bitter now. I thought about the past 2 years since Romy had married my son, how she'd gradually started making little comments about my apartment being cluttered, about how I didn't take care of myself properly, how she'd volunteered to help me organize my medications, then acted like it was such a burden, how she'd suggested I might be more comfortable in a senior living facility. I'd ignored the signs because I loved my son, and he seemed happy. Romy was beautiful, well-educated, and Daniel adored her. What mother wouldn't want that for her child? But now, standing here with my belongings dumped on the doorstep like garbage, I saw the truth. Romy had been planning this. She'd waited until I was at my most vulnerable, fresh from surgery, dependent on others, to show me exactly what she thought of me. The apartment building's main door opened, and Mrs. Chen from 3B emerged with her small dog. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes moving from my crutches to the suitcase to the obvious distress on my face. "Glenda? What's wrong, dear?" Mrs. Chen had always been kind to me. We'd shared coffee a few times, complained about the thin walls and the broken elevator. But how could I explain this? How could I tell her that my own family had thrown me out like trash? "I'm fine," I managed, though my voice cracked on the words. "Just a little mix-up." She looked skeptical but didn't push. "Well, if you need anything." After she left, I fumbled for my keys and let myself into my apartment. It was exactly as I'd left it 3 weeks ago, except for one thing. It felt different. It felt like a place I'd been banished from, then reluctantly allowed to return to. I dragged my suitcase inside and collapsed onto my couch, still clutching Romy's note. The silence was deafening. No phone calls checking on my recovery. No texts asking if I needed anything. Nothing. I thought about calling Daniel, but Romy's words echoed in my head. "He agrees with me." Did he really? Had my own son decided I was too much trouble to deal with? The pain medication was wearing off, and my hip throbbed with each heartbeat. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. I'd raised Daniel alone after his father left when he was 12. I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, gone without so I could give him everything he needed. And this was how it ended? As darkness fell outside my windows, I realized something had fundamentally changed in me. The hurt was still there, sharp and raw, but underneath it was something else. Something harder. Something that would change everything. The first night was the longest of my life. Every time I tried to find a comfortable position, my hip screamed in protest, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Romy's note. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I needed to understand how I'd ended up here. I dragged myself to the kitchen and made coffee with shaking hands. The simple task that had once been automatic now required careful planning with these crutches. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The spare key I'd given Daniel years ago, the one he'd used to check on me when I was traveling, was sitting on my kitchen counter. They'd returned it, like I was some stranger they'd never see again. I settled into my recliner with my coffee and started thinking back, really thinking, about the past 2 years. When had things started to change? It began slowly, I realized now. Little comments that seemed caring but felt wrong somehow. "Glenda, you really should consider updating your wardrobe," Romy had said during one of their visits. "Daniel worries about how people see you." I'd laughed it off, but the words had stung. Then there were the medical appointments. I'd always been independent, driving myself to doctor visits, managing my own health. But Romy had insisted on helping. She'd started picking me up, sitting in on appointments, asking the doctors questions like she was my caregiver rather than my daughter-in-law. "The doctor says you need to be more careful about your medication timing," she'd told Daniel after one visit, her voice full of concern. "I think she's getting a bit forgetful." I wasn't forgetful. I'd been managing my blood pressure medication just fine for 10 years. But suddenly there was doubt in Daniel's eyes when he looked at me. The worst part was how she'd positioned herself as the caring daughter-in-law who was just trying to help. When I'd gently pushed back on her suggestions, she'd sigh and say, "I'm only thinking of what's best for you, Glenda." And somehow, I always ended up feeling guilty for not appreciating her concern. I thought about the holiday dinners. For 43 years, Daniel and I had our traditions. I'd cook his favorite dishes, we'd watch old movies, and he'd tell me about his work, his dreams, his life. But after Romy, those dinners moved to their apartment. "It's just easier," Daniel had said. "Romy's got such a nice dining set, and you won't have to cook." I'd gone along with it because I wanted to be accommodating, but sitting at their table, eating food I hadn't prepared in a space where I was clearly a guest rather than family, something had shifted. Romy would direct the conversation, choose the topics, and somehow I always felt like an outsider looking in. Then there was the incident with my neighbor, Mr. Patterson. He was an elderly man who lived alone, and I'd been bringing him soup when he was sick and checking on him during snowstorms, harmless acts of kindness that I'd been doing for years. But Romy had heard about it from Daniel and called me, her voice tight with what she called concern. "Glenda, Daniel and I are worried about you getting too involved with your neighbors. What if something happens? What if he falls and you can't help him? You could be liable." I'd tried to explain that I was just being neighborly, but she'd cut me off. "I think you need to focus on taking care of yourself first. You're not getting any younger." The message was clear. I was too old, too frail, too unreliable to make my own decisions about how to live my life. Looking back now, I could see the pattern. Every conversation, every suggestion, every instance of help had been designed to make me feel incompetent, to make Daniel see me as a burden rather than his mother. And it had worked. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. For a moment, my heart leaped. Maybe it was Daniel, calling to explain, to apologize. But the caller ID showed Margaret, my sister. "Glenda, how are you feeling? I expected you to call yesterday after you got home." I'd forgotten I'd promised to check in with her. Margaret had wanted to come with me, but I'd insisted I'd be fine. Daniel and Romy were going to take care of everything. I started, then stopped. How could I explain this humiliation to my sister? Glenda, what's wrong? You sound terrible. The concern in Margaret's voice broke something loose inside me. Before I could stop myself, I was telling her everything. About the suitcase, the note, the returned key, about feeling like a stranger in my own family. Margaret was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then her voice came through the phone, sharp with anger. That vindictive little witch. I never liked her. Glenda, there was always something calculating about the way she looked at you. Maybe I really was too demanding, I said, though the words felt hollow. Maybe she's right. Don't you dare, Margaret snapped. Don't you dare let her rewrite history. You've been nothing but generous to that woman. Remember Christmas? You gave her your grandmother's pearl necklace because Daniel mentioned she admired it. I'd forgotten about that. Romy had worn those pearls to every special occasion since, never once acknowledging where they'd come from. And what about when she lost her job last year? Margaret continued. Who paid for their vacation to help her decompress? Who's been slipping Daniel money when their rent was tight? Each memory was like a small explosion in my chest. I had given and given and given, and this was my reward. After Margaret hung up, promising to drive up the next day, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just hurt or disappointment, but pure, clean anger. For 2 years, I'd let myself be diminished, questioned, and slowly erased from my son's life. I'd accepted it because I thought it was the price of keeping my family together. But as I looked around my apartment, my space, my sanctuary, my home, I realized something important. I wasn't the helpless old woman Romy had convinced everyone I was. I was Glenda Morrison, and I was done being anyone's victim. Margaret arrived the next afternoon carrying grocery bags and wearing the determined expression I remembered from our childhood. She'd always been the fighter between us, the one who stood up to bullies while I tried to keep the peace. You look terrible, she said, setting down the bags and pulling me into a careful hug. But we're going to fix this. I wanted to ask how, but I was just grateful not to be alone anymore. Margaret bustled around my kitchen, making tea and organizing the soup she'd brought, chattering about the traffic and the weather, normal things that made the world feel less tilted. It wasn't until we were settled with our tea that she got serious. I've been thinking about this all night, Glenda. That woman has been planning this for months, maybe longer. The timing isn't coincidental, waiting until you're vulnerable, until you need help. It's calculated. I nodded, sipping my tea. I keep thinking about all the little things. How she'd suggest I was forgetting things. How she'd talk about me needing more support in front of Daniel. She was building a case, Margaret said flatly, making Daniel think you were becoming a burden so when she finally made her move, he'd already be prepared to accept it. The doorbell rang, interrupting us. Through the peephole, I saw a young man in a suit carrying a manila envelope. Ms. Morrison? I'm from Patterson and Associates. I have some documents that require your signature. Patterson and Associates. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. Margaret helped me to the door, and I signed for the envelope, puzzled. What is it? Margaret asked as I tore it open. Inside were legal documents with letterhead I recognized. Uncle Frank's law firm. Frank had been my father's brother, a successful attorney who'd never married and had always been fond of me, but he'd died 6 months ago, and I'd only made it to the funeral briefly. As I read through the papers, my hands started to shake. Margaret, I whispered, you need to see this. The documents were from Frank's estate. Apparently, he'd left me something in his will. Something significant that had taken his executors months to finalize. A commercial property he'd owned for decades, fully paid off, currently generating rental income of nearly $8,000 a month. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The property was this building, my building, the place where I'd lived for 15 years, where Daniel and Romy had their apartment, where Mrs. Chen walked her dog and Mr. Patterson lived alone. Uncle Frank had been my landlord all along, and I'd never known it. He'd kept it private, managing everything through a property company. And now, according to these papers, I owned the entire building. Jesus Christ, Margaret breathed, reading over my shoulder. Glenda, do you understand what this means? I stared at the papers, my mind reeling. The building had 12 units, all occupied, all paying rent. I was suddenly not just comfortable. I was financially powerful in a way I'd never imagined. "There's more," I said, flipping through the documents. Frank had also left me a substantial amount in stocks and bonds, plus a life insurance policy I'd never known existed. The total inheritance was just over $1.2 million. Margaret sat back in her chair, shaking her head. "And Romy has no idea." For the first time in days, I felt something other than pain and humiliation. I felt possibility. "She threw me out of my own building," I said slowly. "She dumped my belongings outside my own property and told me not to come back." Margaret's smile was sharp. "Oh, this is going to be good." That evening, after Margaret had helped me set up a meeting with Frank's attorney for the following week, I sat alone and really absorbed what had happened. Not just the inheritance, though that was life-changing, but the position I was suddenly in. I owned the building where my son lived with the woman who'd just humiliated me. I was Romy's landlord and she had no idea. The irony was almost too perfect. For 2 years, she'd treated me like a helpless old woman who needed to be managed and controlled. She'd positioned herself as the responsible adult while painting me as a burden. And all along, I'd been living beneath her in a building I now owned. I thought about the rental agreements, the lease terms, the power that came with property ownership. Romy and Daniel's lease was up for renewal in 3 months. I'd received the notice along with all the other paperwork. As tenants, they'd been decent enough, always paid on time, no major complaints from neighbors. But as family members, they'd failed spectacularly. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me struggling with my crutches and suitcase yesterday, taken from above. Someone had photographed me from their apartment window during my most humiliating moment. The message that followed was from Romy. "Thought you'd want to see how pathetic you looked yesterday. Maybe this will help you understand why we can't have you around anymore." I stared at that photo, at my own pain and confusion captured like a trophy, and felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't just cruelty. It was documentation of her satisfaction at my suffering. Margaret was right. This had been planned, calculated, designed to break me down completely. But Romy had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I was powerless. I saved the text message, including the photo. Then I opened my laptop and began researching tenant rights, lease agreements, and landlord obligations. I had a lot to learn, and not much time to learn it. But for the first time since I'd found that suitcase on my doorstep, I wasn't thinking about what had been done to me. I was thinking about what I was going to do about it. The meeting with Uncle Frank's attorney, Robert Patterson, took place the following Tuesday. He was a sharp-eyed man in his 50s who had clearly respected my uncle and seemed genuinely pleased to finally meet me. "Frank talked about you often," he said, as we sat in his mahogany-paneled office. "He was very proud of how you'd handled everything after your husband left, raising Daniel alone. He wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of." I signed document after document, officially transferring ownership of the building and all Frank's other assets to me. With each signature, I felt more solid, more real, more powerful. "Now," Patterson said, sliding a thick folder across his desk, "here are the current lease agreements for all 12 units. Frank was what you might call an old-school landlord, fair but firm. Most of the tenants have been there for years, and the rent has been kept reasonable, but the leases do allow for increases at renewal time." I flipped through the folder until I found Daniel and Romy's lease, Unit 4B, monthly rent, $1,800. Lease expiration, January 31st, just over 2 months away. "What's the market rate for a unit like 4B? I asked. Patterson consulted his notes. "Based on comparable properties in this area, you could easily charge $3,200, maybe $3,500 for a 2-bedroom with those amenities." Frank was significantly under market to keep good tenants. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "And what's the process for lease renewal?" "You send a renewal notice 60 days before expiration. If they accept the new terms, they sign. If not, they move out. Simple as that." He paused, studying my face. "Is there a particular unit you're concerned about?" "Just trying to understand my options," I said smoothly. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into understanding every aspect of property ownership. I met with a property management company to understand market rates, learned about tenant laws, and studied every clause in every lease. I also began making subtle improvements to the building. Nothing flashy, just small things that showed care and attention. I hired a cleaning service for the common areas, had the lobby painted, and arranged for the broken intercom system to be repaired. Tenants started nodding and smiling when they saw me, clearly appreciating the upgrades. Mrs. Chen even stopped to thank me personally. "It's so nice to see someone caring about this place again," she said. "The new owner is really making a difference." I just smiled and said, "I'll pass along your compliments." The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. I was literally improving the building while living 2 floors below the woman who'd called me worthless. During this time, I didn't hear from Daniel at all. Not a call, not a text, nothing. The silence was painful, but it also confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Romy had convinced him that I was the problem, that cutting me off was the healthy choice. I began documenting everything. The cruel text with my photo, the returned key, the complete lack of communication from my son. I wasn't sure what I'd do with this information, but instinct told me to keep records. Then, 3 weeks after the inheritance, I witnessed something that changed everything. I was coming back from physical therapy, moving much better now with just one crutch, when I heard shouting from the 4th floor. The voices carried down the stairwell clearly. Daniel and Romy having what sounded like a serious argument. "I don't understand why you had to be so cruel about it," Daniel was saying, his voice strained. "She's my mother, Romy. We could have handled it differently." "Handled what differently?" Romy's voice was sharp, defensive. "She was going to move in here permanently, Daniel. I could see it happening. One hip surgery would become staying just until she's better. And then it would be something else. And something else. Until we were stuck taking care of her forever. She never said she wanted to move in with us. She didn't have to say it. It was obvious. And honestly, I can't deal with her neediness anymore. The constant phone calls, the way she looks at me like I stole you from her. I'm your wife, not some interloper." I pressed myself against the stairwell wall, my heart pounding. This was the real Romy, not the sweet, concerned daughter-in-law she played in public. "But leaving her suitcase outside like that," Daniel continued. "Jesus, Romy, what if the neighbors saw? What if she was hurt trying to get it inside?" "So what if they saw? Maybe it's time people knew what she's really like. Besides, she managed fine, didn't she? Proves she's not as helpless as she pretends to be." There was a long silence, then Daniel's voice, quieter now. "I keep thinking about what my dad would say if he knew how we treated her. Your dad left. Remember? He couldn't handle the responsibility either. Look, Daniel, I know this is hard, but we have to think about our future. Do you want to spend the next 20 years being her caretakers? Because that's where this was heading. I'd heard enough." I quietly made my way to my apartment, my mind racing. Daniel was having doubts. He wasn't completely lost to Romy's manipulation, but she was working hard to convince him that I was the problem, that caring for me would ruin their future. That night, I made my decision. I pulled out the lease renewal paperwork and began drafting a new rental agreement for Unit 4B. Market rate for a 2-bedroom in this area, $3,500 per month. Nearly double what they were currently paying. But I didn't send it yet. Instead, I waited. I watched. I listened. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't quick and dramatic. Sometimes it's patient and precise. Romy had taught Daniel to see me as a burden, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. She'd convinced him that cutting me off was the mature, responsible choice. Soon, she'd learn what it felt like to have someone with real power decide she was the problem that needed to be managed. And unlike me, she wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. December 1st. I sent the lease renewal notice exactly 60 days before their lease expired, just as the law required. I'd had my attorney draft it to ensure everything was completely legal and professional. No emotion, no personal attacks, just business. The notice was simple. Their rent would increase from $1,800 to $3,500 per month effective February 1st. They had 30 days to decide whether to accept the new terms or vacate the premises. I hand-delivered it myself, slipping it under their door early in the morning when I knew they'd both be home. Then I waited. The explosion came exactly 4 hours later. I was reading in my living room when the pounding started on my door, aggressive, demanding knocks that echoed through my apartment like gunshots. "I know you're in there." Romy's voice was shrill, barely controlled. "Open this door right now." I took my time getting up, using my cane for support even though I barely needed it anymore. When I opened the door, Romy was standing there with the rental notice clutched in her fist, her face flushed with fury. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" she demanded, waving the paper in my face. I looked at her calmly. "It's a lease renewal notice. I thought it was fairly self-explanatory. Don't play dumb with me. How did you get our rental information? This is harassment." "I'm sorry. I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, keeping my voice perfectly pleasant. "I'm the owner of this building. I have every right to send lease renewal notices to my tenants." The color drained from her face. "What did you say?" "I own this building, Romy. I've owned it for almost 2 months now. I'm your landlord." She stared at me like I'd announced I was an alien. "That's impossible. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment. You don't have money for—" "Apparently I do," I said simply. "The rent increase is perfectly legal and reflects current market rates for comparable units in this area. This is ridiculous. We've been good tenants. We've never caused problems." I tilted my head slightly. "Haven't you? Let me see. There was that incident where someone left their elderly tenant's belongings outside in the weather. That could certainly be considered problematic behavior." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. For the first time since I'd known her, Romy was completely speechless. "Of course," I continued, "tenant relations are just business. Personal matters shouldn't factor into landlord decisions. The rent increase is based purely on market value." "You can't do this," she whispered, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She knew I could. "Actually, I can. I've had my attorney review everything to ensure full compliance with tenant law. You have until December 31st to decide whether you'd like to accept the new lease terms or find alternative housing." Daniel appeared behind her then, looking confused and worried. "Mom? What's going on?" The word mom hit me like a physical blow. The first time he'd spoken to me in over 2 months, and it was in the middle of this confrontation. "Your mother," Romy spat, "apparently owns this building and is trying to evict us." "I'm not trying to evict anyone," I corrected. "I'm offering a lease renewal at current market rates. There's a difference." Daniel looked between us, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. "You own the building?" "I inherited it from Uncle Frank, along with several other assets I wasn't aware of." I kept my voice level, matter of fact. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but I only recently learned about it myself." "This is insane," Romy said, her voice getting higher. "You're doing this because of what happened after your surgery. This is revenge." "What happened after my surgery?" Daniel asked, frowning. I saw the exact moment Romy realized her mistake. Her face went white, and she shot a panicked look at Daniel. "What is she talking about, Romy?" Daniel's voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in it. "Nothing. It's not. She's just trying to cause problems." "Romy." Daniel's tone was the one I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to get the truth about something. "What happened after Mom's surgery?" I stood there silently, watching my son's face as understanding began to dawn. He looked at Romy, then at me, then back at Romy. "You told me she decided to recover at Aunt Margaret's because it would be easier," he said slowly. "You said she didn't want our help." Romy's silence was answer enough. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Daniel continued, his voice getting harder. "What really happened?" I could have spoken up then. I could have told him about the suitcase, the note, the humiliation, but I didn't need to. Romy's guilty expression was telling the whole story. "Daniel, you don't understand." "Then explain it to me," he said sharply. "Explain why my mother, who just had hip surgery, was apparently left to fend for herself. Explain why I haven't talked to her in 2 months when she was recovering from a major operation. She was being manipulative. She wanted to move in with us permanently, and I couldn't—" "She what?" Daniel's voice cracked like a whip. "She wanted help recovering from surgery, and you thought that meant she was trying to manipulate us?" You don't know her like I do, Romy said desperately. She's always trying to come between us, always making herself the victim. Stop. Daniel held up his hand. Just stop talking. He turned to me, and I saw my little boy in his eyes, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Mom, he said quietly, what really happened? I looked at him, this man I'd raised alone, who I'd loved more than my own life, and made a decision. It doesn't matter now, I said softly. What matters is that you're both my tenants, and you have a decision to make about your lease renewal. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something else entirely. It was power, used with precision rather than rage. And as I closed my door on their shocked faces, I realized that sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply letting people face the consequences of their own choices. 3 days after the confrontation, Daniel knocked on my door alone. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wasn't ready for whatever conversation was coming. But when I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there with his shoulders slumped, looking more like the uncertain boy I'd raised than the man who'd abandoned me, I couldn't turn him away. Hi, Mom, he said when I opened the door. His eyes were red-rimmed and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Daniel. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart hammering against my ribs. He sat heavily on my couch, the same spot where he used to do homework while I made dinner after long shifts. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She's been lying to me, he said finally, his voice hollow. About everything. I sat across from him, waiting. I found the note she left you, the one about not being your maid anymore. It was still in her purse. He ran his hands through his hair. And I found the photo she took of you struggling with your suitcase. She saved it on her phone like some kind of trophy. The pain in his voice made my chest ache. This was my son discovering that the woman he'd married was capable of calculated cruelty. She told me you were becoming too dependent, that you were hinting about moving in with us permanently. She said it was better to set boundaries before things got out of hand. He looked up at me, his eyes desperate. But that wasn't true, was it? No, I said quietly. It wasn't. I should have called you. I should have checked on you myself instead of just believing what she told me. His voice cracked. My own mother had surgery, and I didn't even call to see how you were doing. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it was okay. But some wounds needed to be acknowledged before they could heal. No, you shouldn't have just believed her, I agreed. You should have called. He flinched at my honesty, but nodded. I know. I was a coward. It was easier to believe her version where you were fine and didn't really need me. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, I could hear Mrs. Chen talking to her dog. Normal sounds of a normal day in a world that had shifted completely off its axis. I filed for divorce yesterday, Daniel said suddenly. I felt a complex mix of emotions, relief, sadness for his pain, and something that might have been vindication. I'm sorry, I said and meant it. I know you loved her. I thought I did. But I think I loved the person she pretended to be, not who she actually was. He looked around my small apartment, taking in the photos of us from his childhood, the books, the comfortable life I'd built for myself. She always talked about you like you were some burden we needed to manage. But look at this place. Look at your life. You're fine. You've always been fine. More than fine, actually, but I didn't say that. She can't afford the new rent, he continued. She's been calling me non-stop, crying, saying you're trying to destroy her life. She wants me to ask you to reconsider. And what do you want? He was quiet for a long moment. I want to understand why you're doing this. I know I hurt you, and I know she hurt you worse. But this rent increase, it's going to force her to leave the city entirely. I studied my son's face, seeing the confusion there, the genuine desire to understand. For 2 years, Romy worked very hard to convince you that I was a problem that needed to be solved, I said carefully. She positioned herself as the reasonable one while making me seem needy and intrusive. She isolated me from you so gradually that you didn't even notice it happening. Daniel winced, but didn't interrupt. The rent increase isn't about punishment, I continued. It's about market value. This building is my inheritance, my security, my future. I have a responsibility to manage it properly. But the timing, The timing is what it is. Her lease was up for renewal. The rent was significantly below market rate. I leaned forward slightly. Daniel, I'm not going to subsidize the housing of someone who treated me with such cruelty. That's not revenge. That's self-respect. He sat with that for a moment, then nodded slowly. She keeps saying you're trying to control me, that this is just another way to manipulate me into choosing between you and her. Am I asking you to choose? No, he admitted. You're not, because there's no choice to make. You already chose. You chose her version of events without ever talking to me. You chose to believe I was a burden rather than your mother who loved you. I kept my voice steady, but let him hear the pain underneath. I can't make you love me, Daniel. I can't make you want me in your life, but I can make sure I'm never again dependent on people who see me as disposable. We talked for another hour. Daniel told me about the fights he and Romy had been having, how she'd become increasingly controlling and demanding as the divorce proceedings began, how she'd threatened to turn his friends against him to make sure he paid for choosing his mother over her. She doesn't understand that I'm not choosing you over her, he said as he prepared to leave. I'm choosing honesty over lies. I'm choosing the person who raised me over the person who tried to erase you from my life. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a beginning. 2 weeks later, Romy moved out. I watched from my window as she loaded boxes into a moving truck, her face tight with fury. She never said goodbye, never acknowledged me as she left for the last time. Daniel helped her move, but when the truck pulled away, he came back upstairs. Not to their old apartment, but to mine. I was thinking, he said, settling onto my couch with a cup of the coffee I'd made. Maybe we could take that trip to Ireland you always talked about. You know, the one where you wanted to trace Dad's family history. I looked at my son. Really looked at him. The man who'd hurt me deeply but was trying to find his way back. The man who'd chosen wrong, but was choosing better now. I'd like that, I said. 3 months later, we were standing on the cliffs of Moher, wind whipping our hair as we looked out over the Atlantic. Daniel had his arm around my shoulders, and for the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. I never thanked you, he said, raising his voice over the wind. For what? For not giving up on me. For not writing me off completely when I deserved it. I thought about that note on my doorstep, about the suitcase and the returned key, about the months of silence and the pain of believing I'd lost my son forever. You're my child, I said simply. Some bonds can't be broken, even when they're badly damaged. We spent 2 weeks in Ireland, driving through green countryside and staying in small bed and breakfasts. We talked about everything, his childhood, my struggles as a single mother, the mistakes we'd both made. Slowly, carefully, we rebuilt what had been torn down. When we returned home, Daniel moved into a new apartment across town. Not because he was running from me, but because he needed space to figure out who he was without Romy's influence. We had dinner together every Sunday, a tradition we both guarded carefully. The building thrived under my ownership. I raised rents to market rates as leases came up for renewal, used the income to make real improvements, and slowly built a comfortable retirement fund that would ensure I'd never again be dependent on anyone else's kindness. And sometimes, when I passed the apartment where Romy used to live, now occupied by a lovely young family, I remembered that note she'd left me. I am not your maid anymore. She was right about one thing. She wasn't my maid. She wasn't anything to me at all. And that, I'd discovered, was the most liberating feeling in the world. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.